Hi, boys and girls. It's Mrs. Cantos. I'm going to start with chapter one of Because of Winn-Dixie by the author Kate DiCamillo. I'm so excited, boys and girls, to start reading this book with you. I really am. So let me minimize my screen here. I want you to see the camera. Okay, here we go. Okay, now you see what I see. Okay. Because of Winn-Dixie. So the author is Kate DiCamillo. And the publisher is Scholastic. Thank you, Scholastic, for giving us permission to read this book during this time of distance learning. And let's see. Every book has a birthday. And I always like to see the copyright date. And this book was born 2000, in the year 2000. And the author, Kate DiCamillo, who's one of my favorite authors, by the way, I hope to meet someday in my lifetime. She writes amazing books, and this is one of my favorites. And her dedication is for Tracy and Beck because they listened first. Chapter 1. My name is India Opal Baloney, and last summer my daddy, the preacher, sent me to the store for a box of macaroni and cheese, some white rice, and 2 tomatoes, and I came back with the dog. This is what happened. I walked into the produce section of the Winn-Dixie store to pick out my 2 tomatoes, and I almost bumped right into the store manager. He was standing there all red-faced, screaming and waving his arms around. "Who let a dog in here?" he kept shouting. "Who let a dirty dog in here?" At first, I didn't see a dog. There were just a lot of vegetables rolling around on the floor, tomatoes and onions and green peppers. And there was what seemed like a whole army of Winn-Dixie employees running around waving their arms just the same way the store manager was waving his. And then the dog came running around the corner. He was a big dog and ugly, and he looked like he was having a real good time. His tongue was hanging out, and he was wagging his tail. He skidded to a stop and smiled right at me. I had never before in my life seen a dog smile. But that is what he did. He pulled back his lips and showed me all his teeth. And then he wagged his tail so hard that he knocked some oranges off a display. And they went rolling everywhere, mixing in with the tomatoes and onions and green peppers. The manager screamed, "Somebody grab that dog!" The dog went running over to the manager, wagging his tail and smiling. He stood up on his hind legs. Hind legs means he stood up like this. You could tell that all he wanted to do was get face to face with the manager and thank him for the good time he was having in the produce department. But somehow he ended up knocking the manager over. And the manager must have been having a bad day because lying there on the floor right in front of everybody, he started to cry. The dog leaned over him, real concerned, and licked his face. "Please," said the manager, "somebody call the pound." "Wait a minute," I hollered. "That's my dog. Don't call the pound." All the Winn-Dixie employees turned around and looked at me, and I knew I had done something big and maybe stupid too. But I couldn't help it. I couldn't let that dog go to the pound. "Here, boy," I said. The dog stopped licking the manager's face and put the ears up to the air and looked at me like he was trying to remember where he knew me from. "Here, boy," I said. And then I figured that the dog was probably just like everybody else in the world, that he would want to get called by a name. Only I didn't know what his name was. So I just said the first thing that came into my head. I said, "Here, Winn-Dixie." And that dog came trotting over to me just like he had been doing it his whole life. The manager sat up and gave me a hard stare, like maybe I was making fun of him. "It's his name," I said, "honest." Now, what's the name of the store, boys and girls, that she's in? Do you guys remember? Raise your hand. All right, shout out. It's Winn-Dixie. So she said the name of the dog is the name of the store. That's like being in Cardenas saying, "Here, Cardenas, come over here." Get back to reading. The manager said, "Don't you know not to bring a dog into a grocery store?" "Yes, sir," I told him. "He got in by mistake. I'm sorry, it won't happen again." "Come on, Winn-Dixie," I said to the dog. I started walking and he followed along behind me as I went out of the produce department and down the cereal aisle and past all the cashiers and out the door. Once we were safe outside, I checked him over real careful, and he didn't look that good. He was big, but skinny. You could see his ribs, and there were bald patches all over him, places where he didn't have any fur at all. Mostly, he looked like a big piece of old brown carpet that had been left out in the rain. "You're a mess," I told him. "I bet you don't belong to anybody." He smiled at me. He did the same thing again, where he pulled back his lips and showed me his teeth. He smiled so big that it made him sneeze. It was like he was saying, "I know I'm a mess. Isn't it funny?" It's hard not to immediately fall in love with a dog who has a good sense of humor. "Come on," I told him. "Let's see what the preacher has to say about you." And the two of us, me and Winn-Dixie, started walking home. So let's think, boys and girls, before I read chapter 2. What's the setting of the story? Setting of the story means where the story is taking place. So we know we're not at the school, we're at a store. And the two main characters so far are Opal and Winn-Dixie. So we're going to read more of chapter 2. I want you to pause real fast. And you can go ahead and pause the video. What questions do you have for Opal? And what do you think? If you were in Opal's position and you came home and your parents sent you to the store, which I'm sure they don't by yourself, but if they did send you to the store by yourself and you didn't get what your parents needed and you came home with a dog, what reaction would your parents have? Go ahead and pause the video and discuss, either with your parents or discuss, write it out. Okay, welcome back. Some of you paused, some of you didn't. It's okay. Here's chapter 2. I know if I came home with a dog, I'd be pretty much in trouble if I didn't get the food that my mom and dad asked me to get and I wasn't showing responsibility. So let's see how Opal's family reacts. That summer, I found Winn-Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida. So this is the city and this is the state. Just like you live in Ontario, California, this is the name of the city. So he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that's how I got my first name. So India is the name of a country, but he called me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn-Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and stuff and suffering people to go grocery shopping. But you know what? I told Winn-Dixie, "You're a suffering dog." Suffering means you have a lot of pain and you're in distress, like you just have a hard life. "You're a suffering dog. So maybe he'll take to you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you." Winn-Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping like something was wrong with one of his legs. And I have to admit, he stunk bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie that he had to behave right and be quiet because this was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. A preacher is someone in charge of a church, so her dad runs a church. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn-Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Mrs. Detweller's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn-Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. Sit, I told him when we got to my trailer. He sat right down and he had good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. The preacher was sitting in the living room, working at the little fold out table. He had paper spread out all around him and he was rubbing his nose, which always means he's thinking hard. Notice how the author right here doesn't write a sentence. They just use a word as a sentence, kind of emphasize how hard the preacher was thinking. I think that's really clever of our author, Kate DiCamillo. Daddy, I said. He said back. Daddy, do you know how to always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves? Mm-hmm, he said. He rubbed his nose and looked around at his papers. Well, I said, I found a less fortunate at the grocery store. Is that right? He said. Yes, sir, I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding inside its shell, in there thinking about things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. So this would be a simile right here. He's comparing, the author's comparing a turtle to the father. So like a turtle. Daddy, I was wondering, could this less fortunate, could he stay with us for a while? Finally, the preacher looked up at me. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, the preacher said. We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog. I know it. I said, I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look, I said, and I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn-Dixie! Winn-Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed. And then he came limping up the steps into the trailer and put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of a pile of papers. And the preacher looked at Winn-Dixie and he looked at his ribs and his matted up fur. Matted is like all tangled. Matted is like, his hair's like all yucky. Like if I mat my hair like that. And the places where he was bald. And the preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher and he pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered to the floor. What did you call this dog? The preacher asked. Winn-Dixie, I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn-Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. Well, said the preacher, he's a stray if I've ever seen one. He put down his pencil and scratched Winn-Dixie behind the ears. And a less fortunate, too, that's for sure. Are you looking for a home? The preacher asked real soft to Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie wagged his tail. Well, the preacher said, I guess you found one. That's the end of chapter 2. And we'll stop right there. We'll continue. I hope you think of any questions right now and think of what, make some predictions of what do you think Opal and Winn-Dixie's adventures are going to be about. Bye for now.